Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Sweet Angels, and this is part 2 to my 3-part intellectual disability video blog that I've been doing, that I just started doing. So if you watched my last video, you'll have seen some of the missed milestones and symptom struggles that we went through with my son from birth to about 3.5, 4. This video is going to continue on from there with his struggles and milestones, whether they be missed or achieved, from the age of about 4, 5, entering kindergarten now, until about grade 3, 4. And then the next video will be grades 4 to where he is now in grade 5. So be on the lookout for that video to come up shortly after this video. So in the last video we talked about him being in preschool. So he did continue preschool at the age of 4, and he still hadn't been meeting his milestones, though. They wanted to see him grow a little bit more, be sociable, be able to participate in the subjects, be able to pay longer attention. He had a very short attention span, and he still does. They wanted him to be able to start writing his name and drawing basic shapes and colors and all the basic things that you would learn in pre-K. And during circle time, because I always had a circle time at in pre-K, and the teacher would do the calendar, and they would count through the days of the month together, and they would do the days of the week by song. So it was very repetitive. Day after day after day was the same routine. And she would read him a little story and that stuff. And my son wouldn't even count to 5. And that was one of the goals that they wanted of him, is that when the other children were now, like, because they were getting closer to kindergarten age, they wanted him to be able to count up until 5. Because for our school system, in order to enter kindergarten, you needed to know numbers 1 to 10. So they figured if even they could get 1 to 5 out of my son, that would be a really good milestone. He never did get that in preschool. He struggled every single day, even though it was repetitive. He still struggled to be able to count to 5. So they continued on with speech and with occupational therapy. They got him a special type of scissors, and the scissors that he got in school had a spring in them. So, and they weren't the kind that you'd put your fingers in. They were like they almost looked like a pair of pliers that it had a string rope on it, and you would clamp it with your whole hand, and when you let go, it would open back up, and then you'd push back down, and then it opened back up, because he struggled to be able to open and close the scissors to make the cutting motion on the paper. And so they got him a pair of those scissors to try to help him with that, and they gave him all kinds of different visuals to try to learn how to count, how to cut, how to learn the colors. And they discovered that he was a very visual learner. He needed to be able to see it in order to be able to do it. So his EA would start out with, they were called counting bears, but she wasn't really too worried about counting the bears at this particular point in time, because he was so developmentally delayed. He didn't even know his colors, like not even his basic colors. And this was his second year of pre-K. So what they did was, with the counting bears, they had cups that almost looked like the red Solo cups, but one would be red and one would be green and one would be blue. And then there was other colors too, like purple and orange and that stuff. But all she wanted to focus on was red, blue, and green. And there was bears that matched these cups. And you were supposed to count, like, put 3 bears in this cup and 4 bears in this cup equals this many bears. But they didn't worry about that. What they worried about with him was seeing if he could put the right color bear in the right color cup. And in the beginning, he couldn't. He'd just pick up a bear and put it into whatever cup that there was to put it into. And so his EA started working with him more and more and more on that. And she would take him with his hand and hand over hand. And because he was very sensitive to touch, she had to let him know beforehand that she was going to grab his hand and help him to pick up the bear to put it into the cup. And he resisted that at first. He'd pull his hand away. But with her, she would continue to do it time after time after time, reassuring him. And she was amazing. Absolutely amazing. And so he finally warmed up to her enough and would allow her to touch him in a certain way. And she figured out that way it was. And they would pick up the red bear and put it in the red cup, and the green in the green cup, and the blue in the blue cup. And once he learned to do that, then she was able to let go of his hand and say, okay, let's put the bears in. Can you find, the right cup for these bears? And he would put them in the right cups. So he was finally starting to thrive in school. It was very minimal compared to the other children. Like, the other children were starting to learn their alphabets already, and we weren't even remotely learning our alphabets. The other kids were counting to 30, and some of them 40 and 50, and there was even some of them that were counting higher than that. But that's in every grade. You have some children that are higher up than others. One day, I remember getting a phone call from the EA saying, you got to come down to the school and see what he can do. And so I went down to the school, and on the table were the cups, the red cup, the blue cup, and the green cup, and these counting bears. And she showed me how he was able to put each one into each cup, and he was now able to count to 3, I believe it was. He put 3 bears in and was able to count all 3 bears. And this was going towards the end of his second year of preschool. So that was a proud mommy moment for me, to see him being able to count. Even though it was only to 3, he was still able to count. He was starting to be able to sort. And he was really comfortable with his EA. So that was really, really nice to see. So then we entered into kindergarten. Transitioning from pre-K to kindergarten was a struggle, because he did not deal with transition well. When you'd move from subject to subject, he would have a meltdown. And the nice thing was that his EA went with him over to the kindergarten. So he got to know his EA. But then I moved. And he had to start a different school. And it was a struggle. We were in a different area now, different school. This was a bigger school. It was a K-12 school. But they were still really good with him. There was his own EA, and then there was two other EAs, in his school, in his classroom with him. And they worked with him. But he was no longer thriving anymore. The school even went out, because he wasn't potty trained at that school, and I didn't have a license, I wasn't too sure how it would work. But they said that was okay, just to send extra clothes with him, and if he had a toileting accident, that they would clean him up and just go on their day. So they got him one of those toilet seats that you can put on the toilet so that they don't have to risk falling in, because they thought maybe that might have been some of his problems, as he was scared that he would fall into the water, because he was terrified of water at that particular point in time. Giving him a bath was a struggle. Giving him, getting him into a pool. He wanted nothing to do with a pool. Even if it was a little paddling pool, he wanted nothing to do with a pool. So they gave him the toilet seat to see if that would help. And he still struggled. He had bowling accidents daily for a while when he transitioned from one school to the next. And they noticed that he was having meltdowns more often with the transitioning from subject to subject to subject. But they started to break it down for him more, so that they weren't expecting him to do as much as what everybody else was doing. And they were reducing his workload, supporting his workload, and going from there. So when they finally got him to be able to count, because like I said, he was visual. So they would give him visuals to count. So they would start with 2 red cubes and 3 blue cubes, because he knew red and blue was how many, and then they would count them together and he would get 5. But he couldn't recognize the number 5 to the picture of 5. Like, he knew that there was 5 squares there, but he didn't know how to make the 5. So his EA helped him to mark it down on the paper. She wrote it down, and then in a yellow highlighter, and then he was to copy it, and that's how he learned to write his numbers and how to recognize that this many blocks was this number. So when he was in kindergarten, grade 1, they gave him a personal program plan, or a PPP. And in these PPPs, there's goals that they set, and they want you to be able to achieve these goals by like such and such a date. So let me just grab my paper for a minute, and I'll tell you which goals we had on there. One of his goals was transitioning. That 90% of the time he would be able to transition smoothly. And I knew that wasn't going to be the case. He just didn't transition very well at all. He didn't have a whole lot in kindergarten that they expected him to be able to do. More so that they wanted him to be able to achieve learning his numbers and recognizing his numbers and that stuff. And he did slowly start to achieve those. But they did want me to hold him back in kindergarten. And at that particular point in time, I was like, well, what's the point? Kindergarten, it's mainly about play and socialization. And I figured if we were holding him back, we were going to hold him back in grade 1, because grade 1 is mandatory. Like, by the age of 6, your child has to be enrolled in grade 1, out here where I live anyways, whether that's by homeschooling or in a Catholic school, a public school, a Christian academy, it didn't matter. It's just that, and where I live, by law, they have to be enrolled in a program of some sort by the age of 6 or in grade 1. So I decided I wasn't holding him back in kindergarten, and I pushed him on to grade 1. Do I regret that? Yes. But we did end up holding him back in grade 1 because he still wasn't thriving in school. And he struggled a lot. And so when he started that one, he had his IPP or PPP goals, which were still transitioning from subject to subject. Then they had one that he would be able to start a project on his own 90% of the time. He was supposed to meet that by the end of the year, the end of the grade 1 year. And he couldn't. He would go and sit down in his desk, and if he didn't understand it, he would cry. He would cry, and he'd cry, and he'd cry. And when he started crying, there was no way to get him out of that until he was ready to calm down. And his meltdowns could last anywhere from 5 minutes to 2 hours. Like, it really depended on how quickly it escalated and how quickly you were able to break him of it. So it was a struggle. So then that's where it led into his next goal, which was he would not melt down as often as he did. That goal, again, was not achieved. Another goal was that he wouldn't need as much assistance. With a special needs child, you can't expect them to be able to accomplish everything that a child without a disability would be able to accomplish. But the school, because we moved from the one school to the other school in kindergarten, and then we moved to another place for his grade 1 year. We actually moved back to where we used to live for his grade 1 year. And they were expecting things that were, in my mind, unrealistic. So, because you can't ask a child to not melt down who has meltdowns. I could understand if it was a temper tantrum because he wasn't getting what he wanted, but this wasn't a temper tantrum. This was a meltdown. He didn't understand. He couldn't process it. He has a processing issue where he struggles to get things from here onto paper. He can know what he wants to say up in his head, but to get it down on paper, he loses it. And so a lot of his tests and that stuff, like they noticed when they gave him a test verbally, like a verbal test, he was able to answer it and pass the test. But when they gave him a test that he had to write, he failed it miserably. So they started doing more oral tests and oral things with him. So by the end of that first year of grade 1, he still hadn't met what he needed to do. He wasn't reading yet. He was still struggling at basic math, like 2 plus 2, 2 plus 1, 2 plus 3. So they sat me down and they said, look, I know that we asked you to hold him back in kindergarten and you didn't. And I know you feel like we're going to be attacking you, but we're asking you to please hold him back in grade 1 and let us see if we can get him to where he needs to be. So I agreed we would hold him back in grade 1. I felt horrible as a parent holding him back because to me, that meant that he wasn't where he needed to be. He got teased because he repeated grade 1 for some kids teased him, but the teacher sat me down and said, explain it to him in this way, that all it's doing is, by him repeating grade 1 again, is that it means he didn't quite finish grade 1 and he's just going to continue it and do it a little bit longer. But he was a young baby, like his birthday's in December. So going in to school when he did, I could have held him back and if I would have held him back in the kindergarten like they wanted me to, then we wouldn't have necessarily had to hold him back in grade 1. I would never have agreed to hold him back in kindergarten and then hold him back again in grade 1. But we did hold him back in grade 1, and I thought, okay, so now that we've held him back in grade 1, he should be able to meet his goals and his accomplishments and all that other stuff. I don't know if it was the school that wasn't set up for special needs children or if it was just his disability. But he struggled. He still wasn't reading. He still wasn't writing properly. He still wasn't able to make a basic sentence. He wasn't able to do fill in the blanks. He was still struggling with his tests. And teachers would call me in all the time and say, like, we got to try to do something different. What can we do? What can we do? What can we do? I said, he's a visual learner. You got to go by visuals. And so they would try to do the visuals and that stuff, and it still didn't work. So then I remember them saying at the end of it was just before Easter of that second grade 1 year, I went in for a parent-teacher interview, and the teacher said to me, if we could freeze his age, 1 more year of grade 1 would be beneficial. And I almost lost it. I'm like, that would be 3 years of grade 1. I was not putting my child through 3 years of grade 1. Your children go through 12 years normally, of school. Mine's already went through 15 years by the time he is ready to graduate, because he did 2 years of pre-K and then 2 years of grade 1. So 16 years he'll have been in school for by the time he's ready to graduate. So that's a long time to go on with that kind of stuff. So I pulled him from that school and I moved him to a different school that was more set up for children with special needs. It wasn't a special needs school, but what they did is they have a program that has a body break. Like, they've got the body break room, they've got the occupational therapist, and they've got the team members like the speech and language pathologist, the EAs, the educational assistants, and all that other stuff in this school. So we moved him to this other school. But before we moved him to that second school, they did a psyche educational evaluation, is what it was called, on him. And the psyche educational evaluation was checking like all of his testing and where his IQ was, and he came in really low on that. Sometimes, like in some spaces, it was in like less than 1 percentile, and in other things it was like he came in the 15th percentile. There was a few things he came in right where he should have, but most of it was way under. So meaning that like when he was in the less than 1 percentile, that meant like 99% of kids his age were able to accomplish it, and he just wasn't. So anyways, we moved schools after the psyche educational evaluation was done, and they wanted to hold him back again in grade 1 for another year. And when we got to this school, they didn't think that they'd be able to do much because it was already in April, it was April at that time. So they only had April, May, and June left. By the end of that year, so we didn't do an IPP for him that year. They just took his IPP from from the other school and continued with that one. And from the end of that year, at the end of that year, they had him reading at the beginning of a pre-K level. That is how much they worked with him at that school. And I was ecstatic seeing the growth that he had done in 3 months that he couldn't have accomplished at the other school he was attending in 2 years in that one grade 1 classroom, but they got him to do it in like 3 months. So I was absolutely floored. So I talked to them and I said, are you guys planning on holding him back? Because the other school wanted to hold him back. And they said, absolutely not. At this point in time, that wouldn't be beneficial. He'd be getting out of his peer group, and no, we're not doing that. We're going to put him into the grade 2 classroom in a small group setting within the classroom. And the small group was children just like him who were struggling and had developmental delays. But this small group was within the big class, so they were still with their peers and friends and all that other stuff. So they did an IPP plan for him there, and he didn't meet all of his goals there either. It was a lot of struggles. As he got through the grades, his goals would get more and more and more. One goal was always his transitioning, and it still is transitioning because he struggles in transitioning. Another goal that they had set, I can't remember if it was grade 2 or grade 3, was time telling. He could not tell time on an analog clock. You could ask him on a digital clock and he would come to you and say, well, the clock says it's 1, 2, 3. Well, okay, honey, what's 1, 2, 3 mean? And you'd have to tell him 1:23. And he'd go 1:23. He would repeat you. And so by the end of his grade 2 year, they had him understanding digital clocks, but not analog clocks. He couldn't understand, like he'd look at it and go, there's a dot there and a dot there and a dot there, but he wouldn't understand that each line on the clock was either, because the clocks that we had were only in 5-minute increments, and so he couldn't understand that the first one meant that it was, like, say 12:05, and then the second one would mean that it was 12:10. He couldn't grasp it. He still struggles with that. So they continued working on him and working on him and working on him, and he slowly started to meet some of his goals, but he was still struggling. He was now reading at a beginning of a grade 1 level in grade 3. So his reading had come up, and his writing was starting to improve, and his math was starting to improve, and everything was starting to improve because we had a great big huge team of people that worked together. So guys, that is part 2 to the 3-part video line that I'm doing on my son with an intellectual disability, going from kindergarten through to grade 3-4. If you're interested in seeing the video on his grade 4 to 5 year, and where he is now, and his diagnosis with an intellectual disability, he was diagnosed last year with the intellectual disability, so that will be in part 3. Then come on over and check out part 3 of the video. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Part 3 probably will be up in a couple of days. Yeah, continue on with my story. And once I'm completed that story, then I will start the blog on my autistic daughter, my youngest child, and the similarities that she had, the similarities she had with my son. So guys, that's everything I have for you in this video. Thanks a lot for watching, and have yourselves a great day.